Hi, my name is Christian Lee, and I will be covering Asian American discrimination. So, what is happening? Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been racial attacks and hate crimes against Asian Americans on the rise. Um, we've been seeing since the beginning of March that there have been a large increase of discriminatory acts against Asian Americans. There's also been prejudice, there's derogatory language, and racial slurs used. And it's important to understand historically how Asian American discrimination has existed in the United States to understand the aftermath in current events like these racial slurs and how it will affect the community in the future. The course concepts that I will cover are structural racism, internalized racism, historical trauma, and political apology. Structural racism is where an institutional form of oppression occurs. This is exampled as a piece of legislation that will privilege one race over another. Generally, it will be Caucasian over a race of color. Internalized racism is racism within an individual. It is an unconscious form of racism. It's not blatant. It is. It can only really be seen in very subtle actions. Historical trauma is caused by an event that has a deep impact on a family, and it will affect into later generations and can be traced through generations. A political apology is an apology given by a institution such as a government that is the acknowledgement of the government's wrongdoing against a people or a society, and its acknowledgement of what they have done. Some examples of structural racism as the Chinese Immigration Act of 1882. It barred all Chinese immigrants from gaining citizenship in the United States, and there were some exceptions with officials, educators, and merchants. This was later edited out and amended in 1924, which barred all Asians of all ethnicities from gaining citizenship. And this was a really important piece of legislation because it was the first piece of legislation that barred a whole entire ethnicity from entering the United States. It was essentially segregation on a grand scale, global segregation, if you will. Another form of structural racism is President Trump has referred to the COVID pandemic and the coronavirus that is responsible for the COVID pandemic as the Chinese virus, implying that fault and the cause of this pandemic is due to the fault of the Chinese people, which it can be debated upon, but it is generally agreed upon that it is not right to do so. Another form of racism is internalized racism. In the form of Asian Americans, internalized racism, one form is keeping your head down and laying low and working hard. This is a form of internalized racism where the person that is being discriminated against actually adopts the idea that does the discriminating against them. And this ties in with the model minority myth, which gives the idea as long as they work hard and lay down low, they can be accepted into society, and that they are a good model of society. Another example of internalized racism, we've seen mothers pulling their children away from Asians that walk by. This is a little bit more blatant. But it's internalized because it is not directed at an Asian American or an Asian person. It is more that the synonymous idea of Asian people and COVID-19, and which leads to mothers pulling their children away from Asians that walk by. Moving on to historical trauma. An example of historical trauma would be the internment of Japanese Americans in 1942 at the outbreak of World War II. This was due to mass hysteria that many Japanese Americans would have allegiance to the Japanese Empire and would lead to espionage and sabotage in the States. It wrongfully incarcerated 120,000 Japanese Americans. It forced Japanese Americans off their property, and much of their personal property was requisitioned by the U.S. government for use. I actually mentioned in a New York Times article that I used to source information for this. It actually mentions that another form of historical trauma is the idea of keeping your head down low. And we can see that these forms of structural and internalized racism start bleeding into the other concepts of historical trauma. And what we can start to see is that with the COVID pandemic, as we see more incidents of racism against Asian Americans, that it will further cement the idea of laying low and trying to stay out of sight is good, so that you can stay out of trouble. We can see how this is all starting to interconnect. Moving on to political apology. This is the acknowledgement of a government's wrongdoing against a people. And in terms of the Japanese internment in 1942, it took 46 years for the government to officially apologize for their wrongdoing against Japanese Americans. It was signed in the Civil Liberties Act in 1988 by President Ronald Reagan, and the act allowed for reparations to be paid to surviving victims. In a similar idea, in 2009, the state of California officially apologized to Chinese Americans for discriminatory legislation like the Immigration Act of 1882, and even though there were no reparations given to descendants, the idea of apologizing and recognizing the wrongdoing is taking a further step forward in bridging the gap. And acknowledgement of wrongdoing is important so that there's better cohesion between the society and government. Some sources of strength during these times of racism and historical trauma. It has been said that Asians, they work hard so that they can get past their adversity. And I don't really like that idea because it further cements the idea of the model minority myth, but that's what I see. And actually, as an Asian American, that's actually how I approach something, is to bury my head in my work and work harder, and I find strength in that. Another source is strength in family. Asian families stick together and they are very family oriented, and that's where we find another source of strength. Some courses of action to mitigate this would be better awareness of racial incidences. Can allow the Asian American community to look out for each other. It also lets people that are not in the Asian American community to be aware of what other people are doing. It can potentially lead to them, standing up for other people that maybe have an incident happening, and they can stand up and tell people to stop. On a personal level, being aware of who is around you and maybe keeping your distance is another way to deter these racial attacks, as exampled in the COVID pandemic. Moving on to forgiveness, what forgiveness means to me is it's key to restoring relationships, whether on a personal level or on a higher scale of social between societies. Apologies are always appreciated, even if it is long after the fact, as in the case of the apology for Japanese internment or the apology for Chinese discriminatory legislation. It shows that there's acknowledgement and there's bridge work that is being done to prevent such acts from ever happening again. And what is also important to me is that forgiveness can come before apologies are even given, so that this bridge is already being built before acknowledgement of wrongdoing has even happened. Forgiveness is important because it helps us grow as a society, and it acknowledges the fact that nobody is perfect. And when we forgive other people for doing wrongdoing against us, it outstretches the idea that we hope that they would forgive us in the similar circumstances. Thank you for taking the time to watch.